Very lovely to see you all, and so I'll introduce myself to start with. I'm Prof Nicholas Blomley. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Advanced Study, and we're jumping in straight at the deep end here because we don't normally have seminars before we've even welcomed our fellows. So if I may, I will just welcome those of you who are visible to me and probably some who are invisible as well. And how very delighted we are to be kicking off the new year with a new project topic. And it's my great pleasure. We don't do fancy biographical details for our seminars, but I do just want to say a warm welcome to Nicholas Blomley, who is a specialist in geography and law, really. I'm not sure quite where the emphasis lies, but he's been doing some very interesting work on territoriality and space, which is a great interest to me as somebody who works on land rights, of course. So I'm very much looking forward to a seminar. So without further ado, I'll just give you the title, Thinking Territorially About Property. And if I may, I will hand over to you. We just normally do this very informally, 20 minutes or so chat from you, and then a general discussion. And so off you go. Thank you very much, Nicholas.
Hello, my name is Nick Blomley. I'm very privileged to be speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Kwantlen and Katzie First Nation in what is now also known as suburban Vancouver in Canada. I'd like to thank Ronan O'Donnell and other folk in the IAS team for setting this seminar up. I'd also like to thank Christopher Gerard in archaeology and Henry Jones in law at Durham for nominating me for an IAS fellowship this term. I am affiliated, along with others, with Chris and Henry's IAS project entitled Negotiating Landscapes of Rights. Now, this is a project, as I understand it, that seeks to examine the negotiation of rights particularly to commonly held resources. So I take from this project a focus in practice, and if you like, the performance of property, particularly commoning, as I would call it, and a focus on multidisciplinary scholarship, including geography and law. Now, I'm a geographer interested in law, in particular in property, including common property. I'm also keenly interested in the practice of property, how property relations get made, get sustained, get contested, the work they do, in other words, in the world. Now, one dimension to this, which is my focus for the seminar today, is territory, or more particularly, given a focus on practice, territorialization. Let me just share some slides with you. What do I mean by territorialization? What I mean by territorialization is the process by which a set of, broadly speaking, social prescriptions and relations are materialized as territories, as bounded, meaningful spaces deliberately created so as to achieve social ends, operating in particular so as to regulate forms of spatial access, inclusion, exclusion, and so on. How am I thinking about property? Well, that's a very broad question, but property, whether privately held, whether held in common or by the state, for me is intrinsically relational. It produces and sustains a set of broadly state-sanctioned relations between people, also between people and non-humans, that governs the use and benefit of some valued resource, such as land, which is my focus really today. Now, these relations are indelibly power relations. They structure forms of privilege, of dominion, of dependency, in some cases of denial. They can facilitate access and inclusion, but they can also operate through forms, very powerful forms of exclusion. Now, property relations are performed in many ways. One example is narrative or stories, but the question I want to ask here and would welcome your thoughts on in this conversation, and I'm going to just speak for about 20 minutes or so, is broadly, what difference does it make, if any, that property relations are frequently territorialized, that they're manifested in a set of territorial arrangements? What particular work does territorialization do in regards to the performance of property relations? If we're interested in understanding the work that property does, what added value do we get from bringing territorialization into the conversation? And more particularly, my question is this worth a full-length book manuscript, which is something I'm I'm contemplating. I've written a little bit on territory and property, but haven't really thought it through in a more sustained way. So obviously I don't want to waste my time on something that's not worth really engaging in. Now, there isn't, interestingly, much scholarship on this question, on the interface between territory and property. If you go to property scholars, you'll find that in general, property, or rather territory, is usually sidelined or treated simply as an outcome of property relations, as a product of property, rather than doing work in and of itself. Territory appears inert, obvious, and broadly banal. But there is the work of American scholars Merrill and Smith, which I'm happy to talk about. And in general, this reflects the assumption that to treat territory seriously, one is in danger of reifying property, treating property broadly not about relations, but about inert spaces. Because of course you can't sue an acre. Property disputes are not disputes between boundaries, but between people in regards to some resource. Now this rests, of course, on the assumption that territory is some sort of objective thing out there in the world. The danger of such a view, of course, is that it treats space as inert and pre-political in ways that geographers like myself and others would find objectionable. Space is much livelier and social. Now, if we go to geographers, we find a very keen interest in territory, and here the work of Stuart Eldon, who was long at Durham in geography, is really a very a powerful example. The tendency, however, has been to treat territory as a manifestation of state power and an expression of state sovereignty and the kind of Westphalian state logic, rather than property. Although Stuart's more recent work on terrain has moved to some extent to an engagement with questions of land. Now, clearly sovereignty and property are closely related, but for present purposes, I'm going to bracket sovereignty and try to think more particularly about property and the way property relations are territorialized. My instinct here is that exploring the added value of territory is something worth doing. If we want to understand the social and political work of property, I think we need to think about territory, and perhaps vice versa. So let me just give some sort of preliminary points to think through this relationship. The first point is that there is no necessary relationship between property and territory. The territorialization of property doesn't look automatically one way or another. Property relations in land can be territorialized in many multiple ways, with different degrees of exclusivity, temporal permanence, and boundedness, even within what we might call Western liberal property. The kind of white picket fence trope of property, or the Englishman's home is his castle, this is only one manifestation and a very partial one. That said, it's a very powerful one that does require our attention. Land tenure in the pre-modern English rural commons was highly territorialized, but in ways that differ from modern forms. Territory itself can also be differently conceived of. It can be thought of as a calculable geometric space, or as something embedded in particular life worlds. The indigenous scholar, the Lenape indigenous scholar, Joanne Barker, characterizes indigenous Lenape territory as, quote, a mode of relationality and related set of ethics and protocols for lived social responsibilities and governance defined within discrete indigenous epistemologies, unquote. That said, I think my focus is going to be on the territorialization of what we might call modern Western liberal conceptions of property. How might we begin to think about the difference that territorialization makes to property? Following Jeremy Waldron, we might begin from first principles in thinking about the relationship between space and action, or as he would put it, space and liberty. For Waldron, the liberty to perform an action, a human action, requires obviously the availability of a space in which one is free to perform that action. As he puts it, everything that is done has to be done somewhere. No one is free to perform an action unless there is somewhere they are free to perform it. One of the functions of property rules, he argues, particularly as far as land is concerned, is to provide a basis for determining who is allowed to be where. And I would add also who is allowed to do what, where. The rules of property give us a way of determining, in the case of each place, who is allowed to be in that place and who is not. By regulating space, in other words, property rules regulate people. Given that all land is governed by some set of property rules, we are all, by virtue of our embodied spatiality, inside the space of property all the time. Although crucially, under radically different terms. There is no inside or outside to property, I would argue, only graduated positions of conditional access. Access is negotiated with others. That's in a sense what property is about. People who are relatively situated by property law granted particular powers or obligations, like a landlord or a tenant. Everyone's use or benefit of land and the affordances it provides depends on a legal relationship with others, such as landlords or banks who hold the mortgage, or colonial governments who claim ownership over indigenous land. Such relationships in theory can be mutually beneficial, but they can also easily be extractive and dispossessive. Now we can, in that sense, follow what we might broadly term a relational or performative frame, arguing that both property and territory are productive of relations, while also themselves relationally produced. They're produced through social relations more generally. So my thought is that perhaps territory might be usefully thought of as a, if you like, a legal technology or an interaction device that shapes how property relations unfold. Now, property relations are, again, performed in many ways, but frequently they entail forms of what we might call territoriality. The geographer Robert Sack defined territoriality as the attempt by an individual or group to affect, influence, or control people, phenomena, and relationships by delimiting and asserting control over a geographic area. So territoriality, in that sense, is a strategy. It's a form of behavior that uses territory as an instrument for securing some particular outcome. And we might think about the use of territoriality in regards to the workings of property and property relations. A tenant gets a conditional right to exclusive use of an apartment. If she fails to pay rent, she and her belongings are expelled from that space. Territoriality is at work in that moment. The homeless person sets up a tent on city land because that's the only land that's available to them given available property rules. They're expelled from private space, but of course, because that land is owned by the city, they face the constant risk of expulsion. The indigenous person is prevented from accessing their traditional lands as they have been converted into private or state-owned property. Now, Sack, for me, makes some useful arguments, practical arguments regarding the particular work that territorialization does in holding up a set of power relations, including, I would argue, those associated with property. Put simply, and rather crudely, he argues that territoriality is a particularly efficient means by which a set of relations are upheld and articulated. In that sense, territoriality is not simply an end, but a strategic means to power. Following Sack, we can argue that the territorialization of property relations helps to firstly define the universe of things governed by a set of property rules. Everything within this boundary belongs to me. That's a very efficient way of defining a set of relationships. Territoriality in particular also helps to communicate meanings, which are of course fundamental when it comes to property. Communicate meanings via simple semantic markers, notably the spatial boundary. Territoriality also, Sack would argue, helps in enforcing a set of property rules. Crossing a boundary becomes a visible and clear act that prompts an enforcement response, as in the case of an action associated with trespass. Sack also suggests that to territorialize power relations, including, I would argue, property, is potentially to depersonalize them or to depoliticize them, insofar as territory as an apparently reified thing, an object, rather than a social product, appears to be doing the work of exclusion rather than the social relationship that sustains exclusion. So territorialization in that sense perhaps helps to produce what we might, following Tim Mitchell, call the property effect. That is the idea of property as a thing external to us, which of course politically is a remarkably important move. So to return to Waldron, if we're inside the territory of property all the time, and if territorialization structures the freedoms and affordances that land gives us, the territorialization of property is of critical concern. It makes a difference, surely, to how property relations are experienced, lived, and contested. Now, the territorialization of property, let's be clear, is not given. It's a product of social struggle and social dominance. It emerges with and through histories of colonialism, racialization, patriarchy, capitalism. It's grounded in and can be productive of ongoing violent forms of relationality, like eviction. We're inside the territory of property, although differently placed, creating varied landscapes of privilege and vulnerability. Following scholarship on racial capitalism, law and political economy, it becomes interesting to think about how whiteness or racialized subordination and class interests are sustained via the territorialization of property. What work does legal territorialization in particular do to racialize, to expel, to render lives precarious and ungrievable? What work does territorialization do to obfuscate those violences to the extent that it depersonalizes them? It's just the law. And how might property's territorialization create spaces of relative freedom, of alterity and difference? Now, if a book were a good idea, and I'm still not convinced, I have some preliminary ideas on how I would package it. For me, it would be occurring through case studies, which is the way I like to work, drawing on past and present work of mine. And very quickly, here's a sort of rough list of some possible chapter topics. One might be an exploration of alternative expressions of property's territorialization. How does property get territorialized, for example, in indigenous law or in pre-modern European commoning practices? I'm interested also in the hegemonic reach of territorialization, the way in which we think through property's territorial forms, including the white picket fence, or the idea of the castle as one's home. And one area which I think this might be fun to pursue is in things like children's literature or early childhood education, which is fixated on, of course, things like boundaries and boundary setting and so on. That might be an interesting area to unpack. I'm also interested, and I'll come back to this in just a minute, in thinking about early English enclosure, particularly late 16th, early 17th century, which is a fascinating period in which property relations get remade at the same time as conceptions of territory and space get remade in some remarkable and interesting ways. I'm currently doing work on indigenous dispossession or colonial dispossession in early British Columbia, which of course is intrinsically racialized in terms of the way in which people are differently placed or imagined as subjects or as non-subjects insofar as property is concerned. Later on in February, we are talking about some current work I'm doing with precariously housed people, including houseless people, people living outside in British Columbia. And we can think about their challenges and experiences as very much an expression of what it is to live precariously inside a territory that is controlled by another, whether that's shelter managers or the city or railway companies that own land. I'm also interested in thinking about the contestation of dominant modes of territorialization, the way in which alternative possibilities, including, I would suggest, in the second commoning, are being articulated, and the way in which territorialization figures in those stories. But for now, and to conclude, let me just come back to this thread of the IAS project, the negotiation of rights to commonly held resources. One focus for this project, as I understand it, is thinking about commoning as a form of collective access right, which would seem to resonate with an interest in territorialization, as I have described it here, although that raises some interesting questions about the territorialization of commoning. A collective access right is not intrinsically or necessarily spatial, of course. As a commoner, I have a right to participate in the collective governance of a valued resource. But if our focus is land, then of necessity, questions of spatial access are fundamental to commoning, which takes us, of course, back to territorialization. Now, we can think of traditional forms of commoning, like early modern European forms of commoning, as entailing particular forms of territorialization, although in ways that differ in part from those of privatized enclosure. I think of common right as the right not to be excluded from the use or benefit of a resource. So the commoner has the right not to be excluded from, for example, the lord's land in order to go on the land and glean after a harvest, although this is temporally contingent. It only is allowed at certain times of the year. As a commoner may also have the right not to be excluded from control over a strip of land upon which crops can be planted. Although again, this is dependent on a collective decision and again is temporally contingent. The perimeter that bounds the village common, of course, is something that gets jealously guarded through the beating of the bound, famously. Unwarranted enclosures upon the common are also resisted, whether by other commoners or by privatizing landlords. We can then think about enclosure as entailing the imaginative and practical re-territorialization of a set of property relations through things like husbandry and the creation of enclosure hedges, or legal redefinitions of the very meaning of property as something that should be exclusively held by an individual, as well as conceptual reworkings of space more generally through practical forms of surveying and the introduction of geometry and so on. These are things I've written about in the past, and I'm happy to talk about if you're interested. But we can also think about contemporary forms of urban commoning as territorialized, entailing struggles against territorial exclusion and assertions of the right not to be excluded, as evidenced, for example, in the experiences of the precariously housed or in anti-gentrification resistance. The image here is from the downtown east side of Vancouver, where I have done a lot of work. But for now, I will go to pause and thank you very much for your attention, and look very much forward to your thoughts, advice, and criticisms. Thank you.
Well, I'll just start things off, if I may, because I'm very, very interested in the notion of boundaries and how they're maintained, because as you'll be very keenly aware, since you work with Indigenous communities, the notion of boundaries themselves has only been something that really arose when people got into agriculture in a big way and started putting fences around things. And one of the things that fascinates me is how these are maintained in material terms. So you made some very nice references to the performance of territoriality, but I feel that there's a lot of fruitful gain to be made by thinking about the materiality of territory. We did a very nice project on lighthouses a few years ago, and Stuart, of course, was well involved in this, because they stand like sort of territorial sentinels around the coast of national sovereignty, but they also perform a set of functions to kind of warn people off and make it clear that that's the case. And the whole creation of boundaries is something that has, for example, in Australia, where I work, has come in with European settlers, the building of fences and so forth, whereas property was previously located in sort of a locus of a sacred site and sort of emanated out from that, but there weren't actually boundaries per se. So that sense of boundary is materially necessary in order to have a concept of territory. So I wondered if you'd like to say a bit more about the material side.
Thank you, Veronica. It's a very good point. I'm not persuaded that boundaries in and of themselves are specific to, let's say, modern Western liberal conceptions of property. I think it depends on what we mean by boundaries. You can have a sort of zone, you can have relations that move. So I think, obviously, I wouldn't want to speak for indigenous conceptions of property, but my understanding is that very often there are conceptions of boundary at work, but they may take different form. But as to your point about materiality, I think that's a crucial point. And I've written a few years back on the role of hedges. So if you go to late 16th, early 17th century, early English enclosure, you find a fixation with creating hedges, creating so-called quick hedges, living hedges rather than dead hedges, with using hawthorn. And hawthorn, of course, is a form of organic barbed wire. I mean, and so it has clearly symbolic functions, because to build an enclosure is to make a symbolic claim, but also, of course, this is very much about keeping bodies of commoners, bodies of their animals and so on, out of land that is now being designated as exclusive rather than commonable. So the kind of material work, the embodied violent work of the hedge is a fundamental importance.
Yeah, that's lovely. Now I'm going to take our questions slightly out of order, because I see that Joe Painter has one specifically about enclosure. So Joe, if you would like to go first, and then Natalie, I will come to you. So Joe.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Nick. Great to have you with us. The fact that you, I don't think, used the word enclosure in your presentation, correct me if I'm wrong, and I wondered what your view was about the relationship between enclosure and territory. I mean, you referred to early modern England and commoning and so on, and presumably, well, there is perhaps an argument that property as territory comes into being through enclosure, but maybe that's not your view. I'm just interested to know how you would relate those two terms.
So hi Joe. So in particular, property and territory and the relationship between the two and how they unfold in processes of.
Well,
yeah.
So is it the case that territory comes into being through enclosure? In other words, the commons are not territory because they're common.
No.
Or are you arguing that that we don't have that enclosure is not a prerequisite for territorialization?
Well, this gets to, I guess, an interesting question about what we mean by territory, and I'm using territory here in a I think somewhat more expansive sense than maybe others would. The traditional commons is territorialized. It's clearly territorialized. I mean, people know who has rights to what land. People concern themselves with the perimeter of the bounding of the commons as a whole. There is a geography, and it's also territorialized insofar as people's relations to land are mediated and negotiated through forms of territorialization, right? You can go on the Lord's land, that becomes open, but only at certain, only after a festival has occurred. So these are forms of territorialization, but they're not obviously a sort of Euclidean, sharply bounded form of territorialization that I think we do see being produced during this period. And the relationship to property is a complicated one, because property, the meaning of property as a sort of exclusive right is also relatively modern, as I understand it. So I think they're sort of being co-produced in some interesting ways that I think need to be unpacked. Because if property becomes an exclusive right, then questions of excluding people who had rights to one's land in the past becomes a priority. This, of course, is the period when geometry emerges as well, and so there's a sort of conceptualization of territory as something abstract, as something calculable, in the same sense that your relationship to land is supposed to be calculable. And now you can derive individual value from that land. So it's a complicated relationship that it needs to be thought through more carefully. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Nick. Should we let Natalie in now? And then Donald, I see, has a question as well. So Natalie.
Hi, good morning. This is Natalie. I'm a PhD student at UC Irvine, calling in from California. My question's a bit more about territorialization in regards to not private property, but public lands. I'm here thinking really about, like, in California, all of our beaches are technically supposed to be public lands, right? But we've seen that in affluent communities such as Newport, like homeowners near the beaches go out of their way to make it seem like they own that plot of land in order to exclude people. I'm also thinking about public lands as our houseless problem has become worse here in California. It's interesting how fences are being put up in order to exclude houseless folks, but I mean, it's public lands, right? So I'm kind of just wondering your thoughts on the relationship between territorialization and public property as opposed to private.
Natalie, thank you. Those are really interesting questions, and it would take, as with Joe's question, a lot more time to think that through carefully. And I think you're right to think to be interested in this, because we tend not to think about public lands as a form of property, but of course they are. They're very often state-owned property. And the state can act in some pretty exclusive ways and highly territorialized ways. I mean, so here, for example, where I live, it's legal to put up a tent in a park at night, but in the morning you have to remove the tent. So as a person, you're allowed to stay there, but your possessions have to be removed. So it's a form of territorialization that acts upon people's stuff as opposed to their person, because of course persons are legally more consequential in terms of prevailing discourses of rights than people's stuff. This is a theme I'm actually interested in and I'm working on, and I'm giving a presentation in February on some research in which we're actually working with houseless people in regards to their stuff. And what's clear from, if you speak to those folk, is that they're constantly negotiating these forms of territorialization. They're not exclusively public. They're also navigating between land that's owned by state agencies. So it's not, say, city land, but it's owned maybe by the hydro, the energy company that's public here in British Columbia, or maybe rail land that's effectively private. And so exactly where those territorializations apply is not clear. They talk about shuffling between these spaces. Your point about people performing forms of private property in regards to public land is a fascinating one. And we can see that in all sorts of interesting ways. You think about how people think about the road outside their house, for example. If they have a house, I have a right to park my car there, and of course you don't. So the actual question of formal title needs to be distinguished, I think, from how property actually gets practiced on the ground, and those two intersect, but they can also depart. So that's a really interesting thread. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a lecture I went to a number of years ago about how people create space for their families on the beach and make it more exclusive. And it's a fascinating, what it brings to the fore, Nick, is something that came through very strongly, that this is something that is performed, that territoriality has to be continuously performed. And this is much more difficult when it comes to things that you can't put a fence around. So I've been very involved in work on water ownership and the fact that the only way you can own water is actually by performing such ownership, which brings me neatly to Donald's question about learning from comparing a culture of fishing to agriculture. Donald, do you want to come in there?
Yes, thanks. Thanks very much for the introduction. Don Dingwell from Munich. I grew up in a culture which was predominantly historically a fishing community in Newfoundland, and there's very little usable land in an agricultural sense, less than 1% of an island the size of England. So is there anything fundamental to be learned by comparing the way that a fundamentally fishing culture, I mean, literally people whose houses are cabled down to rocks on the side of the North Atlantic, and how they view territory in terms of where they go, they're literally what they call their fishing rooms, versus an agricultural society, which I guess most discussions of territoriality would be aimed at.
Thank you, Donald. That's a very interesting question. I think one would learn from these sorts of comparisons, and I think this is where being interdisciplinary is useful. Property lawyers, of whom I have the greatest respect, they draw their data very often from case law, from what judges have to say, and they tend to, on that basis, make some quite confident claims about property and how property works and so forth. As a social scientist, I'm also interested in how property actually gets practiced on the ground, and how it might differently be practiced in different places. And I would argue also amongst different cultures. We can think about indigenous forms of territoriality as well as Western forms. We can think about pre-modern European forms as well as contemporary European forms. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that sort of comparative analysis. I need to go to Newfoundland, obviously, to do some research there, which I'd love to do, and think more carefully about those sorts of relationships, because it speaks to the relationship between land and water, which we tend to uncouple. Certainly, indigenous folk on the coast here now and in the past will talk about colonial settlers' obsession with the land. Their point being that it's the land and the water that's crucial, and access to water, to the ocean, to the resources of the ocean are equally of importance.
Thank you.
Thank you. That brings up the issue of scale, which is the topic of our next question, in a sense, because clearly there are a whole set of contemporaneous scales in which places or spaces can be owned, whether with water or otherwise. And it strikes me that thinking about those scales simultaneously is quite a challenge, because they can create very different kinds of exclusions. So, for example, an indigenous land use agreement may allow for traditional hunting and gathering in a space, but it'll still be owned by a cattle station, whatever.
Yes.
And so Michelle asked a question about territory as something that can be overlapping or nested, and
Yes.
how do you see the connection between territory and community? I guess those are two different questions, really, but let's start with nesting and scale.
Yes, so that's a very, very important point, because territoriality is not something that can be thought of simply in horizontal terms. We can also think about it in volumetric terms if we want to be clever, because there's some really interesting scholarship that makes that point. I think about fracking and subsurface rights and so on. But clearly, territoriality is about power. It's about power in multiple contexts. So the fact that I'm able to exclude the trespasser from my land is not testament to my power as a person, but rather the ability that I have as a white settler who has fee simple title to mobilize the resources of the state, of course, in particular, which gets us back to sovereignty, which I tried to uncouple earlier on. But clearly, territoriality must be thought of in those relations if we are to understand them carefully. Sovereignty also connects to state property. We go back to Natalie's earlier point. I mean, I have title to this land because 150 years ago, this land was designated crown land by a colonial settler state, state land upon which a white settler could acquire title, and ultimately that chain of title comes back to me. So we can't really uncouple sovereignty and territory as neatly as I'd suggested. There was a second question about.
Well, I'll ask Michelle to speak. I spoke for her rather than letting her ask her own question. So Michelle, do you want to come in and say a little bit more about what you mean about the connection between territory and community?
So I was just thinking, I mean, they are a little bit related, but I think you'll run across some of this maybe in your last idea with urbanism, where you have the individual, you have the neighborhood, you have in some cities gangs and things like this that add complexity where they're sort of unofficial territories. Then of course you have the official territories, however they're divided, going straight up to the nation state, as you highlight. But I wonder, it's sort of getting at this nested idea with the connection between territory and community rather than exclusion. So then you could, maybe the neighborhood level or the is something it's easier to think of it on, and it's power to sort of connect people who might otherwise not be connected at all.
Thank you. That's a very good point. And scholars of territoriality point to the way in which people can identify with territories in the ways that you describe. I suppose I would think of it perhaps less in terms of community and more in terms of identity, in terms of the way people develop identities in relation to propertied forms of territorialization, which is my particular focus. So, the white picket fence is very much about constructing an identity as an individual fee simple owner, deeply tied to, of course, conceptions of patriarchy and whiteness and so forth, and class, which then allows people to also imagine themselves as part of a community of other owners in some particular and often invidious kind of ways. If we're thinking about forms of commoning, then questions of community do come up, but they come up in, for my mind, quite complicated ways that need to be thought through. I've tried to write about this in other contexts and tried to push back against the idea of exclusive kind of forms of commoning. There's a sort of zero-sum logic. It's my common, therefore it's not your common, which to me seems problematic. Thinking instead about commoning as a sort of relational ethic, as back to the right not to be excluded, which complicates, I think, a kind of closed notion of community. That's a rather indirect way of getting at your question, because I'm a little nervous about community and what it can do, I think, in those sorts of contexts. That's a very good question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to invite Anna Stagno. She made a point about 19th century and even later boundaries being not very well defined. Anna, do you want to come in with that?
Oh, yes, thank you. And good evening. Yes, I think that there is also a relationship with what you were saying just now, because commons, as was just said, were something that was aimed, well, not was aimed, but was used to also to exclude people. And it is also difficult to speak about community, because we have to go down on the level of local social groups that not always in the right, assets right to commons were corresponded to a community, but they could be a part of a community, a kinship, or only just some people of the native people of one community. So it is something that is very difficult to say. And I think that there is also an interesting concept of the production of locality that is something very similar to territoriality. It was a concept developed by Aruna Padurai and then developed in an historical way. Sorry, my daughter, by Angelo Torre. And what I would want to say about boundaries, that it is interesting that the state boundaries, but also boundaries between what now we could say as administrative administrative area, were commons, were common lands. And there was a constant need to negotiate the space, to claim the right of use of that spaces. And it also was something that was ritual in the ancient regime, that the boundaries should be confirmed through the use of the space by the local social groups. And it was something that completely changed with the definition of geometric boundaries during the 19th centuries, and also with the development of a precise way of map areas, because before it was not possible. And so I think there is a close relationship between how the way to define territory changed from an institutional point of view and from a local point of view, because while from a local point of view, the process of territoriality still continue in an informal way,
Yes.
because action
Okay,
make
thank
territory.
you. Thank you, Anna. You've given quite a lot
From
there.
an institutional point of view, it was there is a different perspective, because we have a map. I'm sorry, I think there is some problem in my internet connection.
No, I hear you.
That was a comment.
There's lots that's really crucial there. Yes, so reterritorialization doesn't eliminate traditional forms of territorialization. So gleaning, famously in the English context, went on even after formally enclosure had occurred in many cases, and gleaning continues. I mean, in all sorts of interesting social practices, like recycling bottles and so on. Yeah, that transition between these different forms of territorialization is one that I find fascinating, because it allows us to understand these logics in ways that is harder to see in other contexts. So we take, for example, contemporary forms of land surveying as given, but they're very historically specific. I mean, so you see in the English context, you see this transition from traditional forms of surveying, what's called the court of survey, which would happen in the manorial kind of context in the community, where the wise men of the village the elders of the village would come together and essentially collectively perform through walking and through bounding the space, the territory of the commons, which then very quickly becomes the modern form of surveying, the plane table, the theodolite, the geometric, Euclidean kind of logic, in the space of really a generation or two. And so that transition is quite striking. But of course, it, as you point out, doesn't necessarily reconstitute those relations, because those relations have heft to them. They're contested, they're challenged. People tear up enclosure fences or hedges or break hedges. They're deeply suspicious of the surveyor when they show up. There's a wonderful book in England by Norden, Surveyor's Dialogue, which actually you see this conversation happening. It's pro-modern form of surveying, but it also has these feudal kind of manorial remnants still attached to it. Anyway, that's all I can say about it.
Thanks, Nick. That also raises an important point about representation in terms of maps, but also narratives, which brings us to Melanie's question. Can I ask our questioners to be fairly brief, because I can see we're starting to run out of time, and I've got more questions than time. So Melanie, do you want to just come in on social movements?
Yes, thank you. I'll be very brief. It was just, apart from what I've already put in the text, it was just, I guess you mentioned you were interested in alternative conceptions of territory and territorialization, and I find Sam Halverson's definition of territory quite interesting in this context of the appropriation of space in pursuit of political projects. But I'm also finding it very helpful in terms of thinking about urban territory particularly, and the multiple actors and power relations that are brought to bear on different territories and forms of territorialization. And also the way it helps us to maybe understand the notion of overlapping territorialities or multi-territoriality. So lots of things going on in the same space. So I just wondered if you had considered any of that literature, and especially, I guess, if you thought about kind of applying it in reverse, because it's being used in a decolonizing way in Latin American context, but as far as I know, it's not yet being turned back on kind of Western context, where I guess the state and sovereignty is usually more present in debates.
Yes, I know some of that literature, and I've given talks in Latin America where I talk about territory, and it's one of these words that doesn't travel quite so easily, because territory, it usually it's read more in terms of a sort of indigenous or racialized communities or campesinos claiming land, claiming space to advance political ends, as opposed to the sort of Euclidean top-down kind of logics that are kind of smuggled into notions of territory in I think a Western conception. Yeah, so I think it's useful because it opens up it invites us to think about territory and territoriality, I think, more particularly in a more nuanced and open way. That said, we still have to deal with that Euclidean notion, the white picket fence notion of territory and property in particular. We're thinking about property in that relationship. So it's juggling between those two that I think are difficult. I mean, in thinking about this book, one way of thinking about it was to sort of really focus on that sort of white picket fence logic, which doesn't capture what property and territory do, but nevertheless, in terms of the performance, the ideological work that it does, I think really demands our attention. But then we lose, of course, these other nuances that you're also thinking about. So if I'm going to do a book on it, and I'm still not sure, any advice would be welcome on negotiating those two. Thank you.
Well, I think the Occupy movement would be a very nice performative focus, but also working with people who perform ownership via song and dance. That whole essence of performance is there. And I see that Perry Gardner has a question about identity, territory and performance. So Perry, do you want to jump in quickly there?
I'm interested in the notion of shifting identities and power relations within, I won't call it a community, I'll call it a bounded space that's got an identity of its own. I'd like to hear you say a bit more about how identities shift and power relations shift. I'm thinking about the pre-formal enclosure period. And to give you a very crude example of what I mean is, moving across an area I know very well, I'm writing about it at the minute. At one end you've got a manor house, and 15 kilometres away you've got sheepfolds. I might be a tenant in the manor house in one set of power relations, but the lord of the manor coming down for a sheepfold at tupping time or lambing time, doesn't matter what his power relations are, I'm the expert.
Yeah,
that's a fairly crude and fairly gendered description.
Yeah,
but as people move across those spaces, their identities change, and the hermeneutics is interesting.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, I wish I knew more, and I dabble in enclosure and that period. I'm not an historian, so I'd need to turn to others. I mean, it's clear that people's identities are particularly in the kind of the sort of 16th, 17th century moment when you begin to see this transition, but it's very sketchy and it's highly contested and so on. And so you see, this sort of because enclosure is happening very often inside, right? So it's somebody who's in a slightly more privileged position who's able to mobilize the resources and put up the quick hedges to actually try and enforce enclosure. But that of course contests and disrupts a set of relationships that existed previously. And you see, as I mentioned, you see it in the manuals. You see it in things like the husbandry manuals, where you see these kind of two forms of identity and relationship to land in the same breath. So Norden, I think, is really great for that, to see these kind of these two understandings, the kind of the was quasi-feudal understanding of people's relationship to land and to the Lord and so on. But on the other hand, this you must make the best of the land that it's yours now. It's not, you're unencumbered from these relations. So I don't have a good answer. I think it sounds like you know more than I do on that topic.
Well, this conversation can certainly continue. I've got a couple of related...
I read a lot of Jeff Malthus.
I've got one from Ronan that I'm going to give you two at once. A curly one from Ronan about whether there's a link between early modern enclosure and the early modern notion of the family as the microcosm of the state. And then one that would seem to me to be somewhat related from Constance, whether there's a relationship between possession and territory. Is there a way to view territory as an intermediate step towards sovereignty? And so forth. We have to try and tackle both of those next.
Blimey. I haven't had my coffee. It's still like early in the day here in Vancouver. These are tough questions. Ronan, I don't know. Modern notion of family is a microcosm of the state. I don't know. I think possibly. I mean, but we get into political theory and so on, and which I'm not really comfortable. So we'll have to talk about that later. The possession and territoriality. So Constanza, are you talking about possession in the in the sense of just asserting a claim to land. Maybe you could clarify that a little bit if you're able to do that, and maybe I can think that through with you.
Yeah, sure, with pleasure. So what I was getting at was the way in which you attempted to differentiate between territory and sovereignty. Yeah. And that just made me, that just reminded me, or that just made me strongly think about the way in which sometimes property law recognizes territoriality when it recognizes possession as being the root of title, and sometimes it doesn't. So I can demark the boundaries of this space on the public beach, but hereby my title, I don't gain title. There's no way in which this can be recognized as sovereignty. Property law says you don't get to own that. Whereas at the same time, sometimes territoriality and certain types of performances pass through the filter. And I was wondering if that might be a sense in which one can think, at least in some contexts, as of territoriality as an intermediate step towards the kind of sovereignty that a property title would convey. That's the way it was meant. I hope that helps to clarify the question.
So by sovereignty, you mean you don't mean state sovereignty. You mean the sovereign, the sort of quasi-sovereign power of the fee simple landowner. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So sovereignty in the sense of fee simple absolute title. Yes.
Yes. Yes. I think absolutely you can. And you see this, for example, in the case of colonial dispossession. And white settler assertions of property articulated mostly as forms of possession. So I'm seeing this in the research I'm doing with others on Vancouver Island, where settlers, formally there's a process by which you can acquire title to land through what's called preemption, or in other contexts, homesteading, where if you stay on if you're on the land for a certain period of time and you get it surveyed and you do certain performative acts, if you perform property in the right way, then ultimately will give you title, right? Title to the land. But what settlers clearly are doing is they're enacting these forms of possessive acts in I won't say illegal, but kind of extra legal ways. And the relationship, I think, needs to be thought through more carefully, because they're performing sanctioned forms of possession, but in technically illegal ways. Yeah, that then becomes a basis upon which indigenous claims to land are excised, and ultimately it would seem title is transferred to the possessor. But it's what's interesting, I think, are those territorial acts, right? So they're expelling people, they're putting up fences, they're enacting a form of sort of white entitlement, territorial entitlement, in ways that perform property, but they're performing it through that territorial sort of logic. I think that's crucial to understanding this link between possession here and sovereignty, as you put it.
Okay, we're definitely running out of time now, Nick, so I'm going to summarize a couple of questions very quickly about what you've kind of hinted at but haven't really elucidated, which is the notion of territoriality as a process of becoming. So we have a question from Giacomo about Deleuze and Guattari's work, and the notion of emergence and assemblage. And then actually quite interesting related question about insurgence and the challenge of squatting or land occupation, etc., from Alex, and the way in which these can challenge and reformulate ideas and practices of territory, which situates us quite usefully in the notion of this is an emergent process of territorialization rather than a kind of fixed, we often have a very fixed notion of territory, but actually it's very dynamic. So would you like to talk about territory and becoming, which I think
that would be fun to do. Yes, if we follow that sort of performative kind of frame, and I think that would be where I would go, rather than a kind of Deleuzian kind of notion, and a relational kind of understanding property and territoriality, then yes, it becomes interesting to think about insurgent forms of territorialization. And I, of course, was talking about one in the context of 17th century re-territorialization. That's highly insurgent, right? In the moment of the time, that was a radical reconstitution of people's relationships to land and to others, and to more than humans as well, which in a performative sense was ultimately successful, right? There was a reconstitution of relations that did occur. And you can also, I think about forms of squatting as forms of territorialization quite clearly. And so squatting manuals will advise squatters on how to successfully, in a sense, perform property, right? You know, you have to change the locks, you have to act like you have a right to be there, you have to perform possession, actually, and then hopefully that then ripens into some sort of title. Of course, we need then to think about other relationships and the degree to which those are not always successful. So squatters tend, in most contexts, certainly in northern contexts, maybe less in other contexts, to be unsuccessful in their performances. Laws get changed, right? Adverse possession gets redefined in the or squatting gets illegalized in the British context. And so we need to think about other relations of power that are at work in those relationships.
So I think we have to wrap up a bit there, but you have brought us beautifully back full circle to the notion that territorialization is both social, political, material, legal, performative. You know, it is a wonderful topic for interdisciplinary endeavors, and I'm sure that we're going to have many lovely conversations between disciplines on this topic. Thank you so much, Nick, for a very enjoyable time. So thank you everyone who attended and all those wonderful comments, which have got me thinking, and I'm sure they've got Nick thinking too. This conversation will continue. So thank you all very much indeed, and we hope to see you at our next public event.
Thank you, everyone.
You can go and have your coffee now.
Oh, yes. Thank you for your questions.